How do you see caste? See, there is a different ways of narration of caste. One is about the Vedic literature, which Ambedkar speaks about, and there is a recent colonial history where people say that caste has been bought by the colonials. And there is another thing is in the 80s and 90s, they say caste was bought in because of Mandal. So this kind of debates there. So that how do we see where the caste emerged?
I think, I would respond to that question first by arguing that, one of the things that I think would be important to do, and something that I've suggested, is that rather than thinking about the question of what caste is, because as you say, there are a number of responses, from Indology to a very important school of, kind of colonial sociology of knowledge, which believed in a sense that caste was hardened and in a sense reified because of the practices of the colonial state, to the argument about the new politics of caste in the post-colonial period. So that would be one way of saying, what is caste and what has become, what has happened to caste. I think the other way, and something that I think is equally important, and one that really throws light on the fixation on caste, is to ask what is anti-caste, right? What is anti-caste thought, or what is anti-caste practice, or what is the anti-caste movement? So one of the things that really I began doing in my earlier book, in the caste question, was to say that, alongside, or as important as asking the question of how do we think about caste, how do we think about anti-caste? Because it is by asking that question that we can begin to think about not just the anti-caste movement or the anti-caste struggle, but more importantly for me, that we can begin to think about anti-caste thought. And I'll sort of come back to this in a roundabout way by responding to your question of how do I see caste also. I was trained in the early 90s, late 80s into the 90s, and was trained really in the wake of Orientalism, right, and Said's critique of Orientalism, as it were, but also in the wake of people like Bernard Cohn and Nicholas Dirks and a number of others who had begun to really make a very strong argument about the way that caste had taken shape under colonialism. So that was, in a sense, my training. But once I started to do research, and once I was sort of in the field and got interested in looking at anti-caste thought and anti-caste movements in Maharashtra, I realized something. One was that colonialism itself, and so if you want to ask me, do I think about Indology and, a kind of long-term history of caste, that's not what I do. I would really think about caste as in its modern form, caste as a modern category that is always in a kind of which is related to the state, right? That is, that the state actually produces but is also affected by caste, and that colonial and capitalist modernity play a very, very important role in transforming caste in the modern period for us. I think that, so in that sense, colonialism is important because it does a number of things. It does give to caste a certain kind of bureaucratic or institutional life. Okay. The second thing that it does, which I think is equally important, is that caste becomes, in a sense, for the colonial state, a category that can be counted, enumerated. It's a demographic category of population. But caste is also a qualitative category, right? It's not merely quantitative, but there's also a qualitative aspect of questions of stigma, of degradation, of ritual exclusion, shall we say, and so on. And so in this period, caste becomes a very complicated kind of object or analytic. And so in the colonial period, I think what we also see is not merely the practice of the colonial state in defining, categorizing, naming, controlling caste and what caste is, but we see equally on the part of lower caste communities, Dalit and lower caste communities, a deep investment in precisely those politics of representation, representational democracy, number, counting, etc. Because what it allows, especially non-Brahmin communities to do, is to begin to claim for themselves the status of a demographic majority. So the colonial question, right, and people have tended to, the easy reading of the colonial question is to say, well, people want to argue that, the colonial state and colonialism invented caste. And I think this is really a profound misreading of that argument. It's to say that the coming together of capitalist modernity and colonial rule really transformed caste in very complicated ways. And if we are to really think about Dalit and lower castes in this period, they are both constrained by colonial categories of caste, but colonial institutions and colonial ideologies also give to Dalits and lower castes a very important space of maneuver. And so that investment in number actually becomes very important for lower caste communities. So I would say that, one part of what the way that I see caste is certainly that colonialism plays an important role in shaping caste. But I think that, we also need to see it alongside longer practices, critical practices, intellectual traditions, social practices of criticism that anti-caste movements and struggles themselves develop. Sometimes in relationship to the colonial state and sometimes outside of it. So rather than thinking about whether, caste is a colonial construct, I think we could think about how caste is changed, transformed, how it mutates under colonialism. But always by keeping in mind that there were other practices of critique and of social struggle that went together with this.
Okay, actually, when we read about this Ambedkar's book on caste, Annihilation of Caste, the history of anthropology study of caste, this one is there. And there is other writers, Dalit writers, even Phule, and there are other people in the past, even before the colonial invasion.
Sure.
There are writings and about caste, even historical writings. Even the religious texts, Vedic literatures which came before the colonial periods. And what the thing is, colonization, this colonial period during the British, it did give a different shape, a very complex shape to the caste, But isn't it true that it was not an invention? No, it is not an important question. But I want to say that was the only option the British had, in the sense to make it very complex. They were not here to give an emancipation life, but rather they did they stringent the caste formations. One of the examples is in the medical journals. They say when they say that when a municipality is formed, it is literally given to an upper caste, so that the upper caste landlord will be the municipal thing. So that the British didn't do anything; they just structuralized the formation of it. But in other words, British gave some space for Dalits.
Yes.
This is what Ambedkar, even which you were arguing.
Yes.
But
yes.
I would like to say that isn't it that caste was earlier there? British made complicated.
Yes.
But still the British gave a space for Dalits, which was not there in the earlier period of history, an anti-caste struggle in a structural form, which Ambedkar says that we don't want freedom, we want freedom from India, not from Britishers. So that in that context to put, isn't it that more than the complexity, it is the Britishers at least structuralized the formation of caste, which was there already.
Yes.
And then it is...
Sure. I mean, in that sense, and again, as I said, that's what's very complicated about it. You read somebody like Phule, and he's writing at a moment where, in a sense, the British bureaucracy, right, is rigidifying and actually using caste, is giving to the, what he calls a new Brahmin, a very important place. So the ritual Brahmin as a ritual specialist now becomes the bureaucratic Brahmin, right? And so Phule, I think, is very, very astute in recognizing that an earlier social hierarchy is actually the grounds on which colonial rule could be justified. Because let's keep in mind that an important aspect of colonial rule was to argue that native hierarchies existed and that the British themselves were a progressive, improving power, right? And so the argument, and so it's a very complicated way in which the British both strengthen existing social hierarchies even as they argue that what they're doing is merely respecting what's there and that they're not going to interfere.
Yeah.
So this kind of an argument about non-interference while structurally embedding themselves within a caste order, which gives to the upper castes a new kind of power. It secularizes, I think, upper castes.
Okay.
Right? That is, it secularizes them, it brings them within a bureaucratic order, it gives them English, and so on and so forth. That is one thing. But I think the contradictions also that the British and British colonialism puts in place is, it cannot just be restricted to what the British think they're doing. Right? Because the other aspect of this is to say, what are the unintended consequences of what they do? So by investing in things like, modern institutions, the school, the kacheri, the hospital and so on and so forth, by investing in those modern institutions, the British then also open up new institutional spaces. What do we see happening? Well, mill workers, people who go into the municipality, as you're saying, and so on and so forth. Now, these are people who continue to perform manual labor, but they're performing it under conditions of a modern organization of labor. Now, this becomes the contradiction that Dalits and lower castes constantly experience, right?
Yeah.
They're able to, for instance, come into the city, but once they do that, what they end up performing is manual labor again, but under conditions that are modern. You're in a factory space, right? You're in a textile mill. Labor is organized differently. Right? You experience the possibility of social equality even though on the ground you're prevented. So that imagination of social equality that's also opened up, I think is very important. And so that's the complicated thing, right? That there may be a distinction between thought and practice in this period as well.
Actually, you were, in the discussion you were talking about the Britishers trying to structuralize the upper caste, who became a new kind of a Brahmin with a powerful structure. So let me put this way, actually this is the reason I was discussing earlier. Can we put this way that Britishers really gave power for the upper castes? Can you say that? Instead of that complexity made caste, in other words,
Yes.
can we say that Britishers literally gave full power, more power to the upper caste who didn't have power till then? No, they had power, but in a structural form of a state formation kind of a backing.
I mean, the 19th century globally is the period of the emergence, the rise of the modern bureaucratic state. That is the state, regulated by bureaucratic institutions, which is to say a number of institutions that take on the project of governance. Right? And so because this is a modern capitalist formation of the state, albeit in a colonial form, right, that is marked by notions of racial and cultural difference and so on and so forth, you could, I think, certainly say that Brahmanism is transformed. This is Fule's argument, for instance, right? So what Brahmanism is as a structure of power and a structure of governance is transformed. It is secularized also. This, I think, is very important. Right?
Okay.
And so that part, absolutely. But because these are institutions that are based on an idea of equal access, of equality, the unintended consequence is that Dalits begin to make the argument of saying, if this is a public space, why are we prevented from it? Right? I mean, temple entry struggles, tank access, water, etc. The minute that this notion also that the state must have the notion of public interest, let's say, behind it. Once it begins to do that, or once it begins to bring in, let's say, scavengers, sweepers, municipal workers, tram drivers, textile workers, who are lower caste and Dalit, who are in a sense getting also influenced and infected with this language of public interest, then there is an internal contradiction that is built into the structure of the state. Right? And that internal contradiction is to say that this is a state that cannot behave or act on behalf of somebody. Right? This is the difference from, let's say, something like an earlier caste state to what the colonial state does. It has to act on behalf of everyone. Then the question emerges, if it acts on behalf of everyone, why does it exclude large numbers of people? Now you have to justify inequality on totally new grounds. It can no longer be that we've always done it this way. Here are religious books that govern this. Now inequality has to be justified as property, private property, Inequality has to be justified through a completely different normative order. So this, I think, is what's profound. This is what begins to give lower caste and Dalits also a lot of space for mobilization. So that's the contradiction of the colonial state.